the recording and call this meeting to order. Before I dive into the agenda, just want to remind everyone that as permitted by the Governor's Disaster Declaration of May 27th, the determination has been made that an in-person meeting is not practical or prudent for this committee. To ensure that the meeting is as transparent as possible, staff posted the meeting materials 1 week in advance and will provide a recording of this meeting linked on our website, and we'll take all votes by roll call. So Doug, will you go ahead and call the roll for me, please?
Yep, will do. If anybody is sitting in for a regular member, please state your name when I call the member's name. Kama Dobbs, CMAP.
I'm here.
Grant Davis, CDOT.
Here.
Jeff Shriver, CDOT.
Here.
Thank you. Mayor Schelke.
Here.
Thank you. And for the advisory members, John Donovan, FHWA.
Here.
Thank you. Tony Griep, FTA.
I see Tony logged in, so.
We'll come back. Sis Keller, representing the counties. All right. Heather Mullins, representing the RTA.
Present.
Thank you. Chad Riddle, IDOT. All right. And did Tony, were you able to join?
Yes, Tony here. Can you guys hear me?
Yep, we can hear you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
All right, Kama.
All right, fabulous. We have a quorum of voting members. So moving on to agenda changes and announcements. Staff has no announcements and is not proposing any agenda changes. Does any member of the committee want to propose any changes or make any announcements? All right, hearing none, our first item of business is the approval of minutes from our February 10th meeting. Those minutes were posted with the meeting materials last week. Before I entertain a motion, are there any comments or corrections on that draft? All right, hearing none, do I have a motion to approve the minutes as presented?
Schelke so moves.
Davis, second.
Thank you, Grant. Doug, will you go ahead and give me a roll call again?
Will do. Grant Davis.
Aye.
Kama Dobbs.
Aye.
Sorry. Mayor Schelke.
Yes.
And Jeff Shriver.
Yes.
Thank you.
Fantastic. Motion carries. Moving on to our active program management reports. We're a little bit thin on staff this morning, so I'm going to go ahead and give that report. Status reports for both the STP and CRISA active programs, as well as the STP contingency program, were included in the meeting materials sent out last week. The most significant update on the active program is the approval of obligation deadline extensions for 4 shared fund active projects and all 3 of the active CRISA funded projects. With our required June quarterly status updates in progress right now, frankly, most of the status information on both the active and contingency projects is a little bit stale. So I really don't have anything else to highlight today, but those updated status items will get posted towards the beginning of July when we have a chance to review what's coming in now. Are there any questions on the status of any of the projects? All right. The next item is our regional accounting update, which was also included in the meeting materials. Across the region, $57.6 million in STP funding has been authorized so far this federal fiscal year, which is a little bit under a quarter of the funding that's available. So we are falling a bit behind for our federal fiscal year, as we're starting to see some of the impacts of COVID, such as the court closures and staffing shortages kind of catching up to the program. That said, we have had one council, which is the Central Council, that has obligated 100% of their local STP programming, and they were able to utilize over 550,000 of the 6.5 million that was redistributed at the end of last federal fiscal year. Currently, there's about 4.6 million unprogrammed across the 11 councils that will likely be redistributed at the end of this federal fiscal year. But we are still reviewing the obligation deadline extensions for this federal fiscal year that have been approved by the councils and CDOT. So that's the TBD values on the regional accounting update. Is we're still in the process of logging and tallying up those extensions. For the CRISA program, which is the second attachment, we're at 6.8 million of the 42.6 million that's available, having been authorized so far. Since most of those projects got a slow start because we didn't select the projects until about a quarter of the way into the federal fiscal year. I'm not as concerned that we're at that low obligation rate. A number of those projects are targeting both September and November. So I'm confident that early next year we will reach our obligation goals for that program. Any questions regarding the regional accounting? Crickets threw a lot of numbers at everybody. All right. Finally, just as a matter of record, CMAP staff did prepare the federal fiscal year 2023 to 2027 programming marks back in March. These marks do include a significant increase in funding to the region due to the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, as well as some conservative annual increases in the marks that are expected as a result of the IIJA. These are the marks that both the councils and CDOT have used to develop their draft federal fiscal year 2023 through 2027 STP local programs, most of which are in the public comment phase of program development right now. So happy to answer any questions about the marks memo, although it's really here for information. Questions going once? I see nothing in chat. All right, we will kind of move on to the meat of our agenda today with methodology update topics. We've got 4 methodology topics for discussion today, and just like our last meeting, these are items that are being presented for discussion so that staff can get a general sense of the committee's direction, any comments or ideas that need to be incorporated into the application booklet for our next call for project cycle. And then all of the changes will be presented to the committee for action as part of the application booklet approval this fall. So also just a reminder, particularly for those on the phone or in the audience, we will continue this committee's kind of past practice of inviting our audience members to contribute to this discussion with their questions and suggestions today. So our first topic today is eligible project types, and we've got John Hadsma here to talk a little bit about adding rail yard expansion projects to the eligible project type. So this was something we talked a little bit about at our last meeting, and John's going to give you an update on where staff's at with that.
Good morning, everyone. So yeah, as Kama said, at that February 10th meeting, we said staff would look into this a little more, and since we've been actively researching and having conversations around commuter rail yards to really identify ways we can score the need and that benefit of such projects. And, you know, after looking through FTA documentation, other MPO programs, and just doing some general research, staff has really not been able to gather any real recommendation at this time for how the STP program could score a commuter rail yard project. But, you know, however, you know, we've been moving in a positive direction. Yesterday, staff had the opportunity to meet with Metro and McHenry County to discuss potential evaluation criteria, and in those discussions, capacity and condition considerations of a rail yard were really primary touch points on how a commuter rail yard relocation or improvement could be evaluated. So and while staff continues to pursue metrics to use for commuter rail yards, as I said, around those capacity and condition considerations, we're also exploring ways to incorporate rail yards into the transit station improvement category that currently exists, like using certain characteristics to determine station improvement need and benefit. We see an opportunity to use similar elements specific to rail yards. So for example, using characteristics such as train storage, parking capacity, and maintenance capabilities could provide reasonable measures to determine a score. So if there are questions or a discussion that committee wants to have, we are happy to spend some further time talking about this. And if not, staff can continue to work on this and hopefully provide a more substantial recommendation at the next meeting.
Are there any comments or questions from members of the committee? I think, John's been digging into this, and there's not a lot out there to compare this type of project one to the other, but, I think we do think at this point that we could come up with some metrics maybe to incorporate rail yard projects, improvement projects, relocations, or new yards into the transit station category. There's similar types of asset condition metrics that we think that we would be able to use. So as John mentioned, there was a discussion with Metro yesterday. I think we want to have that same discussion with CTA and see if we can make this fit, if that's the committee's desire. If we think that there's so few of these projects in the region that, maybe this isn't the best fund source, then, staff can halt our research and proceed that way. So really thinking, what does the committee want staff to do with this topic?
I guess I would just reiterate my comment from last time, which is there's a lot of different things that are eligible. And I think we're kind of, at least with the shared fund, the idea was to focus it on certain type of improvements. So I'd be a little wary of expanding it, because I think that's a rabbit hole that you can go down that could continue almost indefinitely.
Thanks, Grant. Mayor Schalke, you look like you unmuted. Did you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the more you add, the more complication you bring to the process. And I don't hear much from my fellow mayors about the way it's structured right now. I think we've got a good staff in Kane County that helps us kind of understand it and get through it and work with it. So I don't see a need to necessarily go, different direction than what we are right now. That's what I guess I would say.
Thank you, Mayor. Others? Jeff or any of our advisory members, John or Heather or Tony?
This is Heather. Just some clarification. So rail yards are not expressly eligible currently under the current categories?
Correct.
Is that okay? So if they were to become eligible, I mean, are they competing against these other transit projects? I can't imagine that there would be rail yard applications competing amongst each other. There would really just be this one. And so I guess I'm just kind of curious.
Sorry, Heather, I cut you off so that I could mute whoever was on the phone. Can you unmute yourself again?
Sure. I'm just wondering, there probably aren't going to be a lot of applications for rail yards. And so are they just competing with the other transit projects, or not going to be competing against other rail yard projects? I guess I'm having a hard time understanding how it would be competitive with other projects.
Yeah, I mean, if, we have the option of wrapping it in with the transit station improvement project type, or having it stand alone as a project type. I mean, the way the scoring structure is set up, 50% of the points are about the transportation impact, the need, and the improvement. And so the way we judge need and improvement varies by project type. So, reconstruction is based on pavement condition. Transit stations are based on the condition at the station. I would see this as probably being condition based for the existing yard and the new yard. So those 50 points are competitive within the project type silo, but then the other 50 points are across the board, all project types. So there's a small ranking within the project category, and then it's the larger ranking of all of the projects.
Okay, that's helpful and that makes sense. Yeah, thank you.
Of course. Other thoughts from committee members? It sounds like we're a little bit hesitant to add another project type, but maybe not quite ready to nix it completely. Is there anyone in the audience that wanted to make any comments on this item? And if so, feel free to enter that in the chat or go ahead and self-unmute. All right, seeing and hearing none, I think if the members in attendance today are okay with it, I think staff would like to, continue discussions and see if we can come up with a reasonable proposal that doesn't dilute the program that we have now, and bring this back for stronger confirmation one way or the other at our next meeting. Anyone on the committee opposed to that approach for today? Doesn't look like it. I don't see anybody shaking their heads or waving their arms. So I think we'll take that approach. I hear what you're saying about diluting our process. So we'll keep that in mind as the research continues. Next on our methodology discussions is the preliminary engineering requirements. So staff is proposing just making some modest additions to the application booklet language to clarify what is meant by substantially complete with regard to our requirement that preliminary engineering be substantially complete in order to apply for funding. This same language is also being proposed for discussion at the CMAC and TAP committee later this morning. So specifically, the language changes kind of focus on making sure that the potential environmental impacts of a project have been identified. That if there's any forest park impact, if there's any historic impacts, that those have been identified, and that the review agencies have actually reviewed the sponsor's intent to minimize, mitigate, or avoid these impacts. I know in our last cycle we had some folks meet the spirit of substantially complete by turning in their draft project development reports to IDOT, but those drafts had a lot of empty sections in them, particularly around these environmental items. So the intent of strengthening the language here is to say a draft full of blank sections is not really a draft, and so let's make sure that we're have touched in that phase one engineering the issues that tend to cause escalation in cost or tend to stretch out the schedule. So that's staff's proposal on the language. Also, there's been an increased interest in this region on pursuing the use of the planning and environmental linkages process, or the PEL process, particularly for the more complex projects in the region like grade separations. And so staff is proposing that completion of this process, because it's so much mirrors the NEPA process, that would meet the substantially complete definition for applying for funds through the shared fund. So the specific language is there in the packet. Are there any comments, questions, or concerns about these language changes as proposed?
Yeah, not necessarily with the changes. It's more just, this is more just, I guess, a thought commentary where you're kind of dealing with the catch-22 with this, where you're applying for construction funding that's 3 to 4 years out or more. By that time, your phase one is, you have to revalidate it. So you're having to go through another process again that just is going to add in more delay to it. So I'm not sure what the answer is, but not necessarily. What I'm getting to is if you have a complete phase one, by the time you would get construction funding, you still have to do a revalidation of it, which is going to add in another year to your process or more, depending if new requirements come up at that point. So I think there needs to be flexibility with it. Is what I get where you're trying to go with it, and it can be difficult to not have just one rule across the board, but flexibility, I think, is an important thing with something like this where it's not necessarily a black or white issue.
Yeah, we definitely see that struggle. You know, we've got projects in the shared fund and in the local programs that have design approvals that are years old. Even before they're applying for the construction funding, some of those design approvals are out of date enough that we know that there are going to have to be refreshes done on the approvals. I'm not sure any of us have a good idea for how to deal with that. I suppose that we could entertain, because we have, the quarterly status updates and do a new call for projects, which allows us to, reshuffle the program every 2 years. Is there some kind of check we could put in place, in the next call cycle where, okay, you met your substantially complete to get selected for funding, say this call, 2 years from now, when we're ready to do the next call, we're 2 years closer to that construction phase. Should we be doing a check on the status of those renewals at that point and, sliding projects out if those renewals are not going on schedule? I mean, is that something that you think might work, Grant, or anyone else on the line?
I mean, it's tough because you think you're there and all of a sudden something pops up that you weren't foreseeing. It's almost like, oh, we forgot to make this comment, and all of a sudden now you have to do this, and that sets you back. So even if someone says, yeah, we're there, we're ready to go.
Yeah.
It's just an unknown.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to it. So
That's why you ask a question, right? You want to find an answer. And I think it's something we've been, struggling with as we adapt our programming here. I mean, I think it's absolutely critical to having good cost estimates and schedules to, be substantially done with your phase one, particularly on these large projects, right? To understand you've eliminated down to a preferred alternative. You have at least identified, there are some historic structures. There are 4F impacts and how those are going to be addressed.
and maybe that's just like a judge. I know it gets really tough on your side, but it's like if you're doing a major grade step where you have multiple preferred alternatives, well, yeah, you should be through phase one because you should be making that so you can go forward. But if you're just doing a bridge reconstruction where your alternative is one alternative, like I think there's a different set of kind of milestones you need to be at.
Yeah,
Food for thought.
it is food for thought, and I think it is something that maybe staff can come back with some kind of proposal for maybe what the what the right milestones are per project. And again, I think that to keep our active program management on track, we would need to set, some kind of preliminary, like, okay, your phase one isn't quite there when you applied, but what's the next point in the process where we need to check again? And if you haven't gotten to a good place, you probably do need to be shifted out. So yeah, let's have staff dig into this. I think I mentioned that CMAC and TAP project selection committee is going to see the same language here in an hour or so. And so, I think continue your thoughts, Grant, during that meeting as well. And we can come back to the committee again at the next meeting, maybe with some additional tweaks, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Any other thoughts from committee members? Anyone else on the line? We have a significant number of planning liaisons. It doesn't look like we've got anybody from IDOT at the moment. All right. Well, we will, staff will be back. Stay tuned on this one. All right. The next thing that is on the agenda is the resilience planning factor. So, resilience and sustainability are pretty prominently featured in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. There's the new Protect funding program itself, as well as expanded STP eligible activities related to resilience and sustainability. So Kata Vasek is here from our planning team today to give us a proposal for transitioning our current green infrastructure planning factor to more of a resilience planning factor. So Kate, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks Cam, and good morning everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kata Vasek and I'm a senior planner in our plan implementation division focused on transportation resilience work at CMAP. And just like Kama said, we are proposing to replace the green infrastructure planning factor with a new resilience planning factor. And so what I want to do is start by covering how the green infrastructure factor currently works. The planning factor makes up 5 points. And so half of the points are awarded to projects where the project sponsor has adopted a green infrastructure policy or has a relevant green infrastructure plan in place. And then the other half, the 2.5 points, are awarded to projects that incorporate green infrastructure components like bioswales, permeable pavements, and others. And the planning factor is applied to all of the project types except for bridge reconstructions, bus speed improvements, and safety projects. Next slide, please. So we decided to look into updating or replacing the green infrastructure planning factor based on a desire to first shift equal weight that's currently given to policy and elements, and then also a desire to incorporate resilience into the overall scoring methodology. Next slide. So in looking at what other NPOs have done to score projects for incorporating green infrastructure or addressing resilience, we really found that the best approach would be for us to create a new resilience planning factor that can still award projects that use green infrastructure elements, but is expanded to account for other projects that are have elements that can help build a resilient transportation network. And so we're proposing to create this new planning factor. And we also would like this committee to discuss whether we should be considering having safety projects eligible as receiving the resilience points. So currently safety projects are eligible to receive points from inclusive growth, complete streets, and freight. And then finally, I wanted to give a definition of what we mean by resilience. And in developing this factor, we're relying heavily on the definition from FHWA, and also want to ensure that the factor aligns with federal guidance on resilience improvements through the new Protect program, as Kama mentioned, and then other related programs once we receive that guidance. Next slide. So this is language from the Protect program on what qualifies as a resilience improvement. And I'll just summarize here that generally qualifying elements are those that will reduce the vulnerability of transportation infrastructure to current and future weather events or natural disasters. So this includes flooding, as well as extreme temperatures like extreme heat, extreme cold, freeze thaw, and others. Next slide. In the short term, we're interested in focusing on improvements or encouraging improvements that will reduce flood vulnerability. Although that doesn't mean that elements that reduce impacts from extreme heat or other hazards would be ineligible. We're proposing that some elements are automatically eligible, including green infrastructure, improvements that protect flood-prone transportation facilities, and as well as weather-responsive traffic management strategies. And then we're also proposing to award points that for certain projects that exceed an existing design standard. So this would include stormwater storage using gray infrastructure, compensatory storage, upgrades to drainage structures, as well as roadway elevation above the flood level. And as for policies, generally, this is the same language that I basically presented for the elements coming from the PROTECT program. These generally require transportation infrastructure to be planned, designed, operated, and maintained in a way that reduces the vulnerability of the transportation system to current and future weather events or natural disasters. And I'll just note, there's more research that we can do on sample policies that are out there. Complete Green Streets is one that comes to mind that certain jurisdictions within our region and also across the country have adopted. But we could do more to develop some sample policies to help inform the application booklet if that's desired. So we are proposing to change from applying equal weights to policy and elements to awarding 20% or 1 point for a policy and up to 80% or 4 points for elements. And I'll step through what this could look like. So for the 4 points that could be awarded for elements, 2 points would be awarded to eligible elements that address a climate vulnerability like flooding, and does so in a way that generally enables the facility to function or reduces the impact in a flood condition. Then another 2 points would be awarded to projects that incorporate green infrastructure elements that reduce flooding or not. It sort of is in line with the way that we currently award points to green infrastructure elements. And then finally, the last point would be awarded to projects where the project sponsor has an adopted resilience policy, or if the project implements a resilience plan and makes that connection clear. So on the next slide, I have some examples of how this could play out. So the first one is a gray infrastructure project that goes above and beyond to address a flooding problem, building in more capacity than would be required. This project would receive 2 points, and then it could receive an extra point if a policy in place to bring to a total of 3 points. The second one is a project that incorporates green infrastructure without necessarily addressing the flooding problem. In this case, that element would receive 2 points, and then an extra point again if there's a policy in place to reach a total of 3 points. In the third example, we have a project that incorporates green infrastructure that specifically addresses a documented flooding problem. And so in this case, it would receive the maximum of 4 points for elements, plus the option of an additional point for an adopted policy to reach the maximum of 5 points. And then finally, in this fourth example, we show how a project may use a mix of green and gray infrastructure, again, to address a flooding problem, which again would receive a maximum of 4 points for elements, plus another point if a policy is in place. And so just as I wrap up, I want to give you an idea of where staff is thinking we could be headed for this. We expect to be able to revise the resilience planning factor during the next methodology update cycle to reflect the information that we would learn from a regional effort that's going to be getting underway later this year. And that effort is to conduct a vulnerability assessment of the regional transportation system and develop a regional resilience improvement plan that starts to outline strategies and priority project locations to help reduce the vulnerabilities that are highlighted through the assessment. And specifically, we will have data available on transportation asset vulnerability and criticality, which could be used to inform the resilience score in the future. We'll also have more information on the types of policies that could and maybe should be promoted for implementation and adoption, and that could inform the policy score. And then finally, we could be in a position perhaps to develop a new resilience project type, taking into consideration the previous conversation on pros and cons of adding new project types, but that could be something that we discuss with the committee and explore that could be included in a future call for projects. So that's all I have, and I'm interested in, again, hearing from the committee in terms of whether or not safety projects should be considered for eligibility for this resilience planning factor, as well as answering questions and hearing feedback that you have.
Great, thank you, Kate, for that summary and proposal. Any members of the committee, I think let's start with the proposed change to the point structure and the shift from green infrastructure to resiliency. Any comments or questions from the committee on that portion of this proposal?
Could you maybe discuss or explain how this would account for differences in just the urban environment and the suburban or ex-urban environment, where there's a lot of more constraints in just what you can do in urban environments compared to other areas in the region, and how that would be accounted for in the scoring changes or anything?
You're specifically thinking about to the degree that a project could reduce flooding or another vulnerability?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking, I know you didn't just, an example is, which is not doesn't really impact with this, but like for bridges, how the city, we're really fixed on what we can do with bridges. And I know bridges are not being proposed under this, but like we have constraints of what we can do. We can't really build outside of the footprint that we have. In fact, we basically have to replace as is in kind. So I'm just kind of wondering how restrictions like that or constraints would be accounted for with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a good point that we can start to think about and look into. Off the top of my head, and Cam, I'll let you weigh into the conversation around demonstrating a flood problem and going above and beyond, let's say in the case of using green infrastructure, I think is something that, understanding that these projects are early in the design phase, and to the extent that the drainage plan is completed in the phase one may indicate feasibility of that. But, we also understand that a lot can change over the course of the project design process. I think ideally what we would like to see as an outcome of having a resilience planning factor is really encouraging projects to include those elements just in the same way that the green infrastructure project did. And, awarding some extra points for projects that really do address a vulnerability that does exist. That's sort of, in a way, it's looking a bit forward because, or it's setting the stage for us to then in the future say we have this data, this vulnerability assessment data that really highlights areas of high need that we may be able to take into consideration. But in absence of that, we're saying, it's really on the project sponsor to demonstrate that or document that there is a need and that the project will address it. And I'll also say that, the definition of resilience is very broad. It's intended to, I guess, account for the fact that, you know, a transportation project can't possibly, in many cases, resolve the flooding problem, because that may take a more holistic solution and rely on adjacent property. So yeah, it's doing what you can within the project constraints, I think.
Yeah, I think I was going to say, to tack onto that, Grant, you know, specific to the bridges, of course, is one issue. And I think, you know, that's a conversation we had a couple of years ago, and why the green infrastructure factor is not a scoring factor for bridge projects. But, you know, you're right. It applies also to reconstruction projects within a more densely developed area. And I think, you know, just like the complete streets planning factor, this factor, as Kate just mentioned, I mean, it's about going above and beyond and creative solutions to help the region meet our goals around complete streets, around sustainability and resilience, and green infrastructure. And so, you know, all total, we're talking about 5 points on the 100-point scale here. So, you know, I don't think it's impossible in a dense urban area to get some of these points. And I think that, you know, as the vulnerability study comes out over the next year, for our next call for project cycle, I imagine we'll have some much better refinements and some more defined strategies. So I think the proposal, and Kate, correct me if I'm wrong, is kind of for this year to take that first step towards adding in this resilience idea with our existing green infrastructure. So not to shake up the way we score projects overall, but to you know, start to widen that factor out a little bit.
Thanks. This is Jeff from CDOT, and thanks for this explanation and for the work you've put into this. I think this is going in a good direction, and here is an important factor for us to consider. I'd like to maybe bring up, and this might be in some ways related to what Grant was talking about, but I could foresee a circumstance where there could be a project proposal that actually does not directly address a sort of a resiliency deficiency in one location, but it creates a more attractive or more suitable alternative. Like, so say there's a road or a path or a transit facility that has a resiliency deficiency, and we create a new road or path, an improved road or path or transit facility that may be nearby it, and that improvement improves the ability for the whole network to accommodate if the deficient facility goes down because of a flood or something like that. That in theory at least is improving the resiliency of the whole network and allowing us to work around the deficient asset but it doesn't necessarily like improve the asset where the problem is. It just improves the ability to work around it. Like, does that make sense? Does that qualify as a resiliency improvement under this sort of framework?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Jeff. I mean, what you're really talking about is building in redundancy, which is a resilience strategy, or strategy that would lead to a more resilient transportation system. I think that's something that this proposal does not currently consider, but is something that we could talk about and think about more.
Okay, because that might help, like especially in constrained circumstances where just like we can't change the facility that has the problem, but what we could do is improve other facilities to help work around the facility that has the problem. That might be a case of where redundancy would have resiliency benefits, and if we could account for that somehow, I think that could be beneficial.
Yeah, and Kama, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the approach that we've taken for all of these planning factors is, put it out there for us to, you know, consider and think about, and that we're not necessarily closing the door on other ways, other creative ways to get at the same goals that the factors are really geared towards.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Kate's absolutely right. You know, the way the application workbook is set up, you know, there's some check boxes for I've included this element, that element, or whatever, but there's also an open text field where we say if there's something else that you want to tell staff about to consider for these points, you know, give us a narrative description. I think, you know, it would be impossible to come up with an exhaustive list of check boxes for these applications. It's the same on complete streets. It's the same on the safety factor. So, yeah, I think that, you know, providing some explanation for staff for why a project does meet our resiliency goals here, and you know, staff would make a recommendation then to this committee as part of the scoring, whether to give those points or not. So it definitely is not the intent to close down creative ideas or make sure that we're, you know, considering these kind of secondary impacts of projects, right?
Great, thank you.
Other comments or questions for Kate from any members of the committee or anybody in the audience that had a thought that they wanted to share? All right, well, thank you very much, Kate. I think we will, based on the comments heard here, go ahead and draft up the language to put this into the application booklet and make it part of that consideration this fall. All right. Next, our last methodology item for discussion today is related to our safety projects category. I think we talked a little bit at our last meeting about some staff concerns with kind of lack of gradation in the scoring for the need scoring for our safety project category, because that scoring is tied to the Safer Road Index, the SRI score. Projects in that category, and it's the only project type where this happens, get either 0, 5, 10, 15, or 20 points instead of kind of scaled across the application. So, you know, staff started digging into some ideas for improving that scoring method, and you know, kind of thought about considering adding maybe some of the region's safety priorities, such as, you know, vulnerable users and speed management, into our need assessment, and really just wanted to quickly touch base with the committee for any suggestions on any other safety subtopics that we should, you know, focus our efforts on as we try to identify, in particular, data sources for adding additional components to that need portion of the safety scoring. So kind of looking for ideas here today, and looks like I see Todd Schmitz on the line as well as Victoria Barrett. So anything either one of you wanted to add or clarify as we are asking for thoughts here?
No, I think you covered it, Cameron.
Okay. Anyone on the committee think that there's something for our safety projects that we should be focusing more on for kind of defining the need for these types of projects? Remembering that safety goes across all of our project types, but, you know, we do have the category for projects that are specifically targeting safety. No ideas or thoughts today. All right. Anybody in the audience want to toss out an idea? If not, staff will, you know, proceed with looking at those vulnerable users and speed management and other discussions that are coming out of the safety resource group right now. So, All right. Well, I guess we will move on then to other business today. I have nothing else. Any committee members have anything additional that they would like to discuss today? All right, hearing none. Now's our opportunity for comments from the public. That we haven't been inviting comments throughout. No public comments were received prior to the meeting, so there's nothing to read in the record into the record. Also, I don't see anything in the chat box today. So, anyone that's joined us today want to make any public comment? If so, please unmute yourself and state your name. Give a second here. All right. Seeing no public comment, our next meeting is scheduled for Thursday, August 11th at 9:30 a.m. As we get a little bit closer to that, check in with the committee members probably around the 1st of August to see if there's a possibility for shifting back to an in-person or a hybrid meeting format. So just Thursday, August 11th, 9:30 on the calendars. And if there's no other business, we can go ahead and adjourn. Seeing no one else wanting to speak, do I have a motion to adjourn?
Grant Davis, motion.
Second?
Jeff Shelkey seconds.
All right, we can do a voice vote for this. So all in favor of adjournment, say aye.
Aye.
More importantly, anybody opposed? All right, nobody's opposed to adjourning, so we are now adjourned at 10:25 a.m. Thank you, everyone.